I'm Bob Ottenhoff, and I'm a member of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Netherland-America Foundation. This webinar is one in a series of occasional lectures we hold on civic, cultural, and historical topics. Our next webinar will be held on March 17, when we'll offer a video live stream and analysis on Election Day in the Netherlands. On June 24, we'll be hosting our annual fundraising dinner. We call it the Ambassadors Awards Dinner in honor of previous American ambassadors to the Netherlands. The proceeds from that dinner will fund scholarships for Dutch students to take academic internships in the DC area. If you'd like to learn more about the NAF or the Washington chapter, please go to our website, thenaf.org. In 1884, my great-grandparents left their home in Groningen and endured the long passage to Chicago, bringing along 4 young children. My maternal grandparents left Middelburg in the province of Zeeland and settled in Wisconsin. I'm sure these are immigrant journeys similar to the ones many of your ancestors experienced. I've often wondered what their trip was like. Was it hard? Was it challenging, or was it more like an excursion we might take? I've often wondered what their trip was, whether it was expensive. What did they take with them? What were immigration policies like over 100 years ago? And what did they expect would be waiting for them when they arrived in the United States? Here to help us learn more about these immigrant experiences is Dr. Robert Schoone-Jongen. He's a professor emeritus at Calvin University, where he taught history for many years. His work has concentrated on immigration to the United States through 1920, the American presidency, and the impact of religion on everyday lives. This month, he has 2 fascinating articles in Origins, the historical magazine of the Heritage Hall archives at Calvin. One looks at the dilemma many Dutch immigrants faced on whether to integrate into American culture or remain separate, preserving their Dutch language and customs. The second article looks at how New Jersey Congressman Dow H. Drucker of New Jersey, who was born in Friesland in 1872, responded to the suffragist movement. In today's webinar, we'll take about 45 minutes to hear from Dr. Schoone-Jongen, and we'll leave about 15 to 30 minutes to answer your questions. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box found at the bottom of the screen to direct your questions. We'll do our best to answer as many of your questions as possible. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Schoone-Jongen.
Thank you all very much for being with us. I am assuming now that you can see the first slide that I have here.
We can't.
We can't. Oh boy. What do I got to do?
Should be able to share your screen with us.
Go to share screen. Got it. Got it. Share. How's that?
There we go.
We're on. There we go. How's that?
Now you want to fill out there. Now, perfect. Ready to go.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm very happy you could join us. Immigration is something that I have been studying for 40 years. It's more specifically immigration from the Netherlands. And what we're going to be doing today is looking at 3 people who took the journey at one time or another via the Holland America Line from Rotterdam, which is the picture on the upper left of the hotel that the Holland America Line had in Rotterdam, and to Hoboken, New Jersey, where the docks were in the New York area. And on the right, you have what a typical Holland America Line ship looked like in the era from roughly 1890 to about 1910, 1920. So you see the beginning and the end of the journey across the Atlantic and the way that they made it across. To put this, one of the problems with dealing with the immigration story is getting a handle on how much did this cost. And I'll repeat this along the way, but just to give you a sense for what we're looking at here money-wise. The average cost for a steerage ticket on the Holland America Line in 1900 was $30 per person. Second class was $60. First class was somewhere between $80 and $100. The average American house in 1900 cost roughly $5,000. The average American factory worker in 1900 made approximately $500 to $700 per year. So when you begin to factor in these numbers, you begin to understand how much this could cost for people, especially people with very limited means, to come across. The way I'd like to illustrate it today is to look at three different people. One of them came first class, one came second class, one came steerage. If we were going to parse this out, the steerage people far outweigh the first class and the second class. But each individual coming in with different sets of means played their own role in the Dutch immigration story. The first class person I'm going to look at is a fellow named Theodore F. Koch, who came for the first time in 1884. The second one is a man who essentially was a peddler by the name of Jan Minema, who immigrated in November of 1900, second class. And the third class person we'll look at is Renze Nicolai, who immigrated in 1887 and came from Friesland and will spend the bulk of his time in the United States living in North Dakota. So we'll take him in that order. Theodore F. Koch was born in 1854 on the banks of the Rhine, literally in a castle near the city of Zevenaar. For those who may not be into smaller Dutch cities, the nearest town that you might have heard of to where Loevaart Castle was or is the city of Arnhem. He's born into a family that has more German roots than Dutch. His mother is actually born in Germany. His father was born in the Netherlands. His father works as an estate manager for a German nobleman. So as a young man growing up on this estate, Theodore Koch learned about how to do everything. He learned about how to take care of animals. He learned how to tend and harvest and process crops. He learned marketing from his father. His father was the dike inspector for the neighborhood. And so he learned how to give orders to people. The Koch family had their own separate seat in church that they paid for so that they could sit in a prominent place in the church in Zevenaar and be seen by people who were lower than them on the social scale. When Koch was about 21 years old, his father told him it was time for him to earn his own living. So he went to Germany and worked as a manager of an estate in Germany. While there, he becomes acquainted with a German industrialist who has extra money that he likes to invest, and he invests his money in a business that Theodore Koch will start in roughly 1880 as a commission agent, buying and selling commodities. He is headquartered in the city of Groningen, and he becomes connected to another company of commission agents, the company of Prins and Zwanenburg. Prins and Zwanenburg, as you can see here on the slide, among other things, have connections to what became the Holland America Line, selling tickets to would-be immigrants and actually recruiting immigrants to sail to America on the ships of what became the Holland America Line. The primary things that Koch is buying and selling for his first several years is potatoes and straw, buying them from Dutch farmers and selling them in the Ruhr Valley to German industrialists and coal mining concerns. This is a tough time in the Netherlands, especially in the northern Netherlands economically. Koch learns how to buy and sell in 4 different languages. He grew up knowing German and Dutch both because of his household situation. He acquired a facility in English as a young adult, and also in French. So he has money from a German industrialist behind him. He has the ability to speak in 4 different languages fluently. But he's looking for things to buy and sell. In the mid-1880s, there's kind of a craze among some people in the northern Netherlands to begin exporting black and white cows to North America. And so in 1884, Theodore Koch will cross the Atlantic for the first time, not first class on the Holland America Line, but he will come across the Atlantic on a ship, a British ship that was retrofitted to hold live animals and get them across the Atlantic. He arrived in New York on the 9th of August of 1884, and his destination is the quarantine station, where the cattle had to stay for 30 days before they'd be allowed into the United States. During that period, he took a trip to the West with the son from one of the sons of the Prinsen-Zwanenberg partnership. And Martin Prins is there to inspect land possibilities that the railroads have for offer for sale to prospective farmers in Minnesota and what became South Dakota in 1889. So Koch takes this trip. And when the trip is over, he and Martin Prins and a third person who they met along the way, who came from Denmark, form a partnership and buy 34,000 acres of land in central Minnesota, about 100 miles straight west of Minneapolis, with the intent of selling off these thousands of acres in 80 to 160 acre parcels to would-be farmers. They target as their primary group of people to sell to Dutch immigrant farmers who had been in the United States for at least 10 years, were living on the outskirts of Chicago or in the area of Hoboken, Wisconsin, particularly men who were roughly 50 years old, who had a number of sons and were looking for more land so that they could set their sons up on farms as well. And this becomes the birth of a significant Dutch colony in central Minnesota, 100 miles west of Minneapolis, St. Paul. Koch does have a life besides selling land. He got married in 1887, and he named a town in his colony in central Minnesota after his wife, Clara. Her name still graces the name of the town. He also learns if you're going to sell to immigrant, not just Dutch immigrants, but immigrants in general, it really worked well to have good relationships with the ministers or the clergy, the Catholic priests, Protestant ministers. These are the people that Koch would use as kind of his advance men to convince these rather skeptical immigrants that they should really go to Minnesota and start to farm on what is, at that point in time, uninhabited prairie. It worked. The partnership made significant sums of money from their investment in this land. They doubled their investment in terms of their inventory, sold all that off. So Theodore Koch becomes a very wealthy man, selling land with German financing behind him to Dutch immigrants from mostly Iowa or Wisconsin and Illinois, and then a little bit later from Iowa. He will spend his entire life doing this. In the 1890s, his focus in Minnesota shifts to the east central part of Minnesota. And here's a map that shows the area, all those green spots you see on there. Most of them are pieces of land that if you bought them, Theodore Koch would get 7% on the sale. He named one town in this area Friesland, and he named another town 7 miles away, just up the railroad, Groningen, and proceeded to sell this land to would-be Dutch farmers coming in mostly, again, from Iowa and the older Dutch colonies further to the east. When he ran out of land in Minnesota, he went to Texas. And in Texas, instead of buying land from the railroad companies, he bought land from the King Ranch and proceeded to try to sell that. He also bought land east of Houston, this area over in here, which he tried to sell to Dutch people who came down from Chicago. He isn't as successful in Texas. A number of things got in the way, one of them being weather, another one being World War I, which dried up his German capital and put him in a bad way with the United States government because he was using German money. But he will press on through the 1920s, trying to sell land in Texas to people of German Catholic background and also Dutch Reformed background. The Catholics down in the area by Corpus Christi, and the Dutch Reformed people up here in Hampshire County in a town called Winnie. He saw himself as a pioneer. Late in his life, he gave an interview to somebody from the Minnesota Historical Society, who asked him how looking back, he viewed his life. And he said, "My work was to bring people from high-priced land to lower-priced land where farmers could buy 1 or 2 farms for their sons." So there you have, in one sentence, what he thought his life amounted to. What's interesting about him, and unique really among the immigrants, is the nature of his job makes it so that he goes back and forth across the Atlantic a number of times. And you can see here that he's doing it roughly every 4 to 5 years, sometimes more often. There's a big gap, obviously, between 1910 and 1928 because of World War I. But he maintains his connections to Europe face to face. Every time he crossed the Atlantic, it cost him at least $120 one way. And he would also bring his family with him. So you have these family connections to people back in Europe that he maintained literally for his entire life. His wife was actually German. His daughter, who you see here in this picture, will marry a German. In fact, her husband will be killed or will be wounded fighting in the German army during World War I. Theodore Koch's 2 sons will both graduate from Harvard University. One of them with a business degree and the other one with a law degree. Theodore Koch's son, the one standing next to him here, will be training American fighter pilots in the United States in the American Expeditionary Force in France, while his brother-in-law is on the other side of the Western Front, fighting for the Germans. My point is, Koch comes with money. Because Koch has money, Koch has possibilities, and Koch has mobility. He will tour the entire North American continent looking for land. He will go back and forth across the Atlantic multiple times. He will become an American citizen, but he is remains very proud of his Dutch heritage. He will become the vice consul for the Netherlands in St. Paul, Minnesota, where he lived for about roughly 20 years. His connections and his reasons for going to Texas are tied to the presence of Dutch engineers who are working in the oil fields in the area of Beaumont. So these are people he can talk to. So in some cases, even people that he had known back in the Netherlands. He and people like him are helping to determine where the other immigrants lower down in the economic scale are going to go. He decides this is land these people could farm, and I'm gonna sell this land to them. The second one, full disclosure, this is my great-grandfather. He doesn't come so much to invest the way Koch did. My great-grandfather came because of what he believed. He was at least as an adult, he became a devout Calvinist. He was baptized in the Hervormde Kerk. He will spend his entire life in the Reformed Church, both in the United States and in the Netherlands. And he will not just belong, but he will be very active in them. He's born in the north, in Cornum, which you can see if you're not familiar with where Cornum is. It's one of these places, if you blink, you won't see it on the road. Just north of Leeuwarden. Just before Christmas, 1858. So he's 4 years younger than Theodore Koch. His early life was not particularly easy. When he was a teenager, his father died. And when his father died, in order to keep the family together, his mother began a small-time grocery business in the town of Cornum. But for largely economic reasons, at the age of about 16, Jan Minema leaves Cornum and goes to Amsterdam. And he will work as a laborer, largely for people in the produce business in Amsterdam. He goes back and forth to Cornum often enough to spot a young lady who he thinks he would like to marry. Unfortunately, she did not grow up in Cornum. I got to back up and show you this. She was born in Britsum, which is about 3 kilometers away. You can walk it in about 15 minutes. Trust me, I've done it. If you're aware of what life was like in rural places in Western Europe in the 19th century, the rivalry between little places like Britsum and Cornum could be, to put it mildly, fierce. And the rivalry would become particularly fierce when the issue at stake was who gets to marry who. The idea of a young man going into Britsum and wooing a young lady from Britsum away from the local young men of Britsum is something that could literally put your life in jeopardy. And in the case of my great-grandfather, on one of his trips back from Amsterdam, he went to see his girlfriend in Britsum. He was on his way back to Cornum in the afternoon, and somebody jumped him, knifed him in the back, and left him for dead along the road. They never found out who did it. But the family lore is it was the suitor in Britsum who my great-grandmother had said no to. And my great-grandfather ended up with a big knife wound and scar in his back. He also apparently punctured his lung. His lung was punctured in the attack because they said he had respiratory problems for the rest of his life that were largely attributed to that. This is one of these stories that doesn't get told. None of this came out until my great-grandfather died in 1926. When the doctor who signed the death certificate asked my great-grandmother, where did that scar come from in his back? And then she told the story. Well, they can't live in Britsum. They couldn't live in Cornum. So when they got married, they went to Amsterdam. And they lived basically in this neighborhood for the next 15 years. They also lived for a time, a couple of years in Baarn and also in Zoest. which are just just to the east and south of Amsterdam. And Jan rises in the economic scheme of things from being an employee to being an entrepreneur. And what he did was to go into the bread and butter business as a peddler. And here's one of his business cards, which, by the way, you can notice right there on the bottom, if you can see it well enough. The printer who printed his card was on the same street that he lived on in Amsterdam. He goes into this butter and egg business, peddling door to door. He does well enough at it that before they leave in about 1896, 97, roughly, he opens his own store in Amsterdam, in the neighborhood where he had been living since 1883. He had also joined a religious upheaval in the Netherlands in the mid-1880s that was led by Dr. Abraham Kuyper, who becomes the Dutch prime minister in 1901. And this was a movement within the Reformed Church that, among other things, stressed the need for there to be Christian, faith-based social organizations, schools, hospitals, those kinds of institutions. And my great-grandfather really picks up on this idea. He wants his son, as most parents would, to follow in his own footsteps as far as religious matters. And when his oldest son is approaching his 18th birthday, Jan Minema decides he has to leave the Netherlands. Not because he has to economically, because he's doing pretty well. He's going to leave the Netherlands because he does not want his son in the Dutch army. He's afraid of what his son would turn into if he was subjected to a couple of years of living in a barracks with some rough and tumble characters. The question was, 1900, where do we go? So the story is that my great-grandfather takes two cards, and he writes on one card, Africa, on the other card, America, puts them down on the table, face down, called his son into the room and told him, pick a card. His son picked a card, flipped it over, it said, America, to which Jan replied, that's where we're going. The other card, my grandfather asks, what's the other card? And said, well, take a look. He flipped it over to South Africa. Think about this. Jan Minema would have been willing to go to South Africa in the middle of the Boer War to keep his son out of the Dutch army. It gives you an idea of where his mind was in terms of his beliefs. He also then has to finance this trip. He sells his business, furniture. The one thing that I know for certain that they brought with them was a pair of little ceramic dogs that they had been given as a wedding present by a sea captain friend of his. That came to North America with them. Beyond that, I don't know, other than their clothes and a couple of books, the Bible, hymn book, things of that sort, that what it was that they brought with them. They certainly didn't bring any furniture, but they were able to afford to buy second-class tickets, $63 a person. I have the page. You can see the page from the Holland America Line records. They're all there from 1900 on online for free from in the archive of the city of Rotterdam. He paid $63 a ticket. Plus, at the same time, he paid an additional $4.50, $5 for railroad tickets to get him from Hoboken to Paterson, New Jersey. He knows exactly where he's going. He knows exactly who he is going to meet. It is on the registry. He is going to meet a distant relative / friend by the name of Frederick Decker, who is the minister of what's the First Holland Reformed Church of Paterson, New Jersey. And this is the building, and the house you can see to the right would be the first house that my great-grandfather and his family would have set foot in the United States. That was the parsonage. He and Reverend Decker have a quick falling out because he asks Reverend Decker, literally one of the first questions this Jan Minima will ask is, where is the Christian school? Where's the private school? A Kuyperian school. And Reverend Decker just said, you mean that Dutch school? My great-grandfather did not join First Holland Reformed Church. He joined Second Christian Reformed Church, which is about 4 blocks down the street, because he wanted his kids in a separate religiously based school, the kind of thing that he had embraced in the Netherlands. And then he has to find a job. And he found that job because of the church that he went to. Because in that church, there was a man who was kind of a foreman and later on became one of the white collar office guys at a dye house in Paterson. So here's Paterson, New Jersey, roughly 1900. This is what the buildings look like, these factories. It was largely a textile town. It was the Silk City. It had textile mills, dye houses, cotton mills. It had railroad foundries, railroad shops, iron foundries. It was one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. It was a politically prominent city. Literally 1 year before my great-grandfather came to Paterson, there was a massive state funeral in Paterson that attracted the President of the United States, William McKinley, because the Vice President of the United States, Garrett A. Hobart, had died in office. And Hobart came from Paterson. In the 1890s, think about this, the Vice President of the United States, the Attorney General of the United States, and the Governor of New Jersey and a United States Senator from New Jersey all came from the city of Paterson. That's how prominent this place was. It's got a problem, and it's this down here, the dye houses, which used the river that runs through Paterson as a sewer. The dye houses look like this. They're hot, they're wet, they're damp. They are well lit, and the work is horrific. They're also dealing with aniline dyes, so you begin to wonder what kind of long-term respiratory problems, the dyes are carcinogens. For 10 years, Jan Minima, who had been a peddler in the Netherlands and a storekeeper, worked in one of these places over these vats for 10 years, living in houses that, among other things, had problems with bed bugs. They also lived in a couple of places that were literally down by the river, so they'd have the smell of what the river smelled like, and the diseases that were in the river, and the river flooded every couple of years. This was his lot in America. His wife, they said, cried a lot, especially when they had the house with bed bugs. But he has his eye on he has his eye on 2 things. One is he wants to be a good, he wants to become involved in doing socially useful things. And he is elected a deacon in this church. And as a deacon in this church, he becomes instrumental in organizing what became a mental health hospital that still exists in the Paterson, New Jersey area, that was founded by the Dutch immigrants. It was organized in 1910. It finally opened in 1917 and became one of the premier psychiatric hospitals in northern New Jersey. It's a faith-based organization. And Jan will serve as the vice president of the board for about 18 years, or for 8 years, excuse me, until his health begins to fail and he had to resign. But he came to America because of what he wanted to practice what he believed. And he wanted his kids to practice what he believed. And he did well. He finally left the dye house in 1910, went to work as a clerk in a grocery store. Sounds familiar? That was owned by another Dutch immigrant. And within a year after that, he started his own peddler route. Again, going from one Dutch neighborhood in the Patterson-Passaic area, from one to the other, first by trolley car, later by bus. He did not own a car. He would take a suitcase with him. And he would go door to door in the Dutch neighborhood selling tea, coffee, and underwear. And he kept his stock in the house. So he's dealing with wholesalers. He does well enough on his peddler route that within 5 years, he buys his own house. And remember what I told you, what I said about that's $5,000. Well, okay, he undoubtedly borrowed money. I can almost guarantee you I know how he got them, how he borrowed. He didn't borrow from a bank because banks didn't loan money to people like him. What the Dutch immigrants had done beginning in the 1870s in the Patterson area was to organize a burial fund, the Holland America Mutual Burial Fund. And they had pooled their money into the burial fund. You borrowed money from the burial fund to buy your house, and then you paid the burial fund back. This is how the people in that particular area did that. He will own that house outright before he's dead. And he actually also bought 2 lots when he bought that house. He sold the second lot to his son, who became a carpenter, and his second son built a house on that lot that he proceeded to move his family into. So here's a man who came because of what he believed. The third example is Renze Nicolai. His is a story of much more endurance. If he had it tough in many ways, but as you'll see, the story comes to a rather happy ending. He's born in Verwaard in the northern part of Friesland. His father was a laborer, one of these people that when he got a job, he had a job. When he didn't, he sat around the house. He's born into this area that is economically depressed for an extended period of time. So when he becomes a teenager, he leaves Verwaard and he goes to a bigger town, Harlingen. He stayed in Harlingen maybe a year at most, and then he moved to Leeuwarden. He goes to an even bigger town. So think about it. We've got people being displaced from rural areas heading to more urbanized areas. And Leeuwarden passed for a city in that region. In Leeuwarden, he meets a young lady local who grew up there. They got married, and he will spend a number of years trying to earn a living as a wholesaler, retailer of cigars. All indications are that he is not being terribly successful at this. And the big telltale seems to be from the municipal records, he moves constantly. He stays in Leeuwarden or in a suburb right just across the river. But he moved something like 5 times in 7 years, which makes you wonder why. Well, the other sign of why is that in 1887, he leaves. And he leaves specifically for Orange City, Iowa. And he arrived in New York on the 8th of August of 1887. He paid $30 per person to get across the Atlantic. He had his wife with him and 2 sons. So you figure out, where do you get $120 when he's not doing well selling cigars? The odds are that the answer is in his destination. The state of Iowa actively recruited immigrants from the Netherlands. In particular, a man by the name of Henry Hospers, who had come to the United States in 1847 to Pella, Iowa, with Hendrik P. Schulte, one of the original ministers who started bringing the Dutch immigrants over in the 1840s. Henry Hospers had done quite well in the real estate business in Pella. And then in 1870, decides to go out on his own and starts his own colony in Northwest Iowa. Organizes a bank that he owns, gets to own about half of the land that became the city of Orange City, sells off building lots, and he becomes a recruiter, an immigrant recruiter for the state of Iowa. He will put ads in Dutch newspapers. He will actually go back to the Netherlands himself to, on at least one occasion, to actively recruit people to come over. And he would also then be in a position to offer to pay for people's tickets who couldn't afford to buy their own, because he would have connections with what became eventually the Holland America Line. And so Brunza Nikolai and his family arrive in Orange City in 1887. They stayed there for 3 years. If he was going to be in Orange City and he didn't have any connections, certainly he was not going to make enough money to support a family selling cigars. That meant he had to become something like a farm laborer. He was not satisfied. That is certainly the case, because by 1890 he will go away from a place that looked like this and folks who looked like this, and they change it for Roseland, Illinois, in the southwest, in the southern part of the city of Chicago, where there is another sizable Dutch immigrant community. The difference is, in Roseland, he could get a job doing something else besides being a farm laborer. He could have worked, maybe he even did. He could get a job, for instance, working for George Pullman building railroad cars, because the Pullman works weren't that far from here. Well, what he does do that we can really document is he becomes a house painter. So he's gone from selling cigars to painting houses in Chicago. In roughly 1900, there are a number of house painters in the Chicago area who are organizing themselves into a labor union. For religious reasons, largely, Nikolai refuses to join the labor union. So he starts getting hassled by the union organizers. He feels so threatened that he buys a pistol and gets a permit to carry it. And because he's afraid of what might happen to him someday when he's up on a ladder and the union organizers come around. Well, in 1905, that happened. He was out painting a house with his two oldest sons, and the union organizers came, and he was up on the ladder painting the gable way up there on the top, and the organizers made a move to knock his ladder down. He pulled out his pistol and shot down at the organizers. They ran off. The neighbors were, this is the kind of thing that normally happened in a Roseland neighborhood. And the neighbors called the cops. Renza tells the police officer, "This is why I did it." The cop said, "And go home." By the account that I have of what happened that day, it appears that might have been literally the last day that Renza Nikolai will ever paint a house in the Roseland neighborhood of Chicago. And one reason why is because there was in that neighborhood a salesman who worked for a land company, not Theodore F. Koch, but another one, a guy named William Brown. And William Brown was selling land on behalf of the Northern Pacific Railroad Company, which was the same company that Theodore F. Koch worked for. And William Brown is looking for people to buy land along the green lines on this map. The green lines are the lines of the Northern Pacific Railroad Company. And specifically, let me get it here. We're looking at selling land. Here's Mandan and Bismarck. This recruiter is looking to send people down here. In 1905, this branch line here was not there. So it is roughly 75 to 100 miles from here to here. And Renzo Nicolai takes up the opportunity with a couple of his neighbors to take a train trip to Mandan, North Dakota, get off the train, go into buckboards to go from Mandan to this little town here, Flasher. And then they bought land here in what became the hamlet of Lark, North Dakota. This is virgin prairie. They have to bust the sod. They have to build a house. The first winter in Lark, North Dakota, Renza and his sons are living in a tent through blizzards and all kinds of other things. They had one neighbor about 2 miles away who had a house. And when the weather got really, really bad, if they could make it there, they would take shelter in that guy's house. They endure prairie fires. If you've ever read Ole Rovag's Giants in the Earth or some epic novel like that about life on the prairie, everything that's in there happened to Renza Nicolai and in his first couple of years out here. What's remarkable is he had enough of his neighbors from the Chicago area who came out here with him and bought land out here that they were able to organize a church. Renza Nicolai will spend the rest of his life living in Morton County, North Dakota, and then later on in Emmons County. He will, his sons will become farmers. He will farm till almost to the day he dies. His wife will be buried in Emmons County, North Dakota, near the town of Strasburg. In fact, let me go back to the map and show you one other thing about how there were enough Dutch folks at one point who thought this was a good place to go, that the railroad company, this case the Milwaukee Road right here, named a town Zeeland. If you look real hard on maps, you can still find it. It might even be on your GPS if you look hard enough. So in the case of Renza, if you think about it, here you have a man who had struggled in Leeuwarden. He had inched his way across the Atlantic under really dire conditions. If we have a couple of minutes later, I can read you a description of what it was like in Steerage in 1911 even. He does not succeed in Northwest Iowa. He has his life literally threatened by what he's endeavoring to do in Roseland, Illinois. He goes to southwest North Dakota, and this 30 below zero winters, and he survived. Not only survives, and not only endures. By local standard, he actually thrived. He owned a farm, and he came to an area that he didn't leave. So that, by way of kind of summarizing, you look at somebody like Theodore Koch, there will be hundreds of people, thousands of people like him. They come first class. These are the people who financed and cited where the immigrant communities went. You look at somebody like Jan Minema. He comes across the Atlantic and he becomes one of the leaders in immigrant communities. There'll be thousands of people like him, people who were entrepreneurs, people with a certain amount of education, etc. Then there will be literally thousands of people like Renza Nicolai. There'll be more of him than any other kind. They become the people who populate these immigrant communities. And when they find a place where they can feel like they're rising or at least enduring, they will stay. The flip side of somebody like Renza was, and I have to throw this in real quick, for every Renza who found a way to get from Orange City to Roseland to North Dakota, there were others who never found their way out of a place they wished they had never gone to. Jan Minima will know a lot of people in Patterson who are going to work the rest of their lives in the dye houses. Short lives, I might add. But they did it because that's all they had. They couldn't move elsewhere. And now we're back to the beginning. How am I doing for time, Bob?
Okay, great. Yeah, that was perfect. It's about 10 minutes to 1. I think we've got 10 or 15 minutes to take your questions. If you do have a question, there's a box at the bottom of this screen, a Q&A. Type your question in there, and we'll present it to Professor Schoone-Jongen. I think there is some interest in learning a little bit more about what the experience was like in steerage.
Yeah.
Maybe you can describe just a little bit about that. And I said that in my introduction.
Yeah.
Like, was this a terrible trip? Was this like just really awful? Like we read about the Puritans coming here in the 1700s?
It was better. It was better than the Puritans. Okay.
Okay.
With the advent of big steamships, time was less of a problem. If you look at immigrants who were coming before roughly 1880, we're looking at a month to 6 to 8 weeks to cross the North Atlantic. With steamships, we're looking at somewhere between 10 days and 3 weeks, depending on weather conditions and how well the boat was built. Just look. The money was in steerage. They could pack as many as 1,200 to 1,500 people in steerage for one trip across the Atlantic. On a ship like that would be the third or fourth SS Rotterdam. In 1911, William Howard Taft, the president, got this report. I'll just read 2 sentences. This is steerage, 1911, after they had made it, quote unquote, better. The open deck space reserved for steerage passengers is usually very limited. They would let them out up on the deck once a day. And situated in the worst part of the ship, subject to the most violent motion, it's at the back. To the dirt from the stacks and the odors from the hold and the galleys. So these are coal-fired ships. The only provisions for eating were frequently shelves or benches along the sides or in the passages of sleeping compartments. Dining rooms were rare. If found, they are often shared with berths installed along the walls. So you're eating and sleeping in the same place. Toilets and washrooms are completely inadequate. Salt water only is available. This is 10 days. The ventilation is almost always inadequate and the air soon becomes foul. I'm going to be graphic, folks. It's lunchtime, I'm sorry. The unattended vomit of the seasick, the odors of the not too clean bodies, the reek of food, and the awful stench of the nearby toilet rooms make the atmosphere of the steerage such that it is a marvel that human flesh can endure it. That is steerage 1911 by the official account of the United States Commissioner of Immigration. Okay.
Wow, that's amazing. So how do you think how were they fed then? Were there cafeterias, or did you bring your own food in advance? Or
basically, if you could bring some with you, but of course it had to be stuff that didn't need refrigeration. It's one of the reasons a lot of them brought sausage, because it was cured and it could endure, sort of. What the ship companies would give out was, for steerage people, was basically stew and oatmeal. That's what you'd have for 10 days. But one of the things to remember is what they thought they were coming to. And what they thought they were coming to, for better or for worse, was a better chance. They would get a job when they came. The other thing they had heard, and which was true, that there was never a famine in the United States. And if you think about people that endured, in the early days, it was the potato famine and things like that. Man, this is just unbelievable. The cartloads of food. And if I think about my great grandfather's, not competitors, but colleagues in the peddling business in Patterson, a lot of them were produce peddlers. You know, they go around the neighborhoods with truckloads of produce, or truckloads of meat, no refrigeration required, and you know, saw off a hunk, and there you had it. You could eat and you could get a job in the United States.
So you mentioned Rotterdam as
Yeah.
one of the places
Yeah.
that immigrants left from. I, I think I've heard stories that they were also leaving from Hamburg and
Yes.
maybe from Amsterdam. How
Yes.
many different locations they leave from, and how many trips in general were coming per month from the Netherlands to the US?
Well, if you think of it this way, a ship like the Rotterdam could make the crossing. Let's take round numbers, 2 weeks. Then they have to refit in New York and go back. So a ship like the Rotterdam could cross the Atlantic probably 13 times a year, maybe. Hamburg would be less because it's further. So a ship would probably maybe do 11 round trips a year. The people who are coming out of Hamburg would be largely people out of Central Europe, and Germany, obviously, Poland. Amsterdam, my great-grandfather actually got on board in Amsterdam, and then transferred onto the Rotterdam in Rotterdam. But he booked his passage from Amsterdam to Paterson. It's in the ledgers.
So if you're from Groningen or Friesland,
Right.
Where do you go? To Rotterdam?
Well, if you're from Groningen, you'd probably go to Hamburg.
Okay.
Especially if you're from Eastern Groningen. If you're from Friesland, you would probably go to Harlingen and get a small ship there that would take you either to Amsterdam or Rotterdam, and then transfer there. If you came from the east, from Gelderland, you'd probably, well, of course, by the 1880s, there's going to be the railroad system, but also the canal boats that were being used to transport people as well.
And if you're from Middelburg, where do you leave from?
From Middelburg, you'd go up to Amsterdam.
Okay.
Or to Rotterdam to catch the big ship.
Okay.
So
So
it all has to do with how deep the ports were.
So I'm sure you were ready for this question. Is the Mr. Koch you spoke about any relation to the Koch brothers? Because if I remember, they were from Texas, I think, originally.
Yeah, the Koch brothers actually lived in Texas, but the Koch brothers' father was an immigrant from the Netherlands who went to West Texas and went into the newspaper business. The Koch brothers' father came from Groningen, but he is not related to Theodore Frederick Koch at all, unless you go way back in the woodpile somewhere.
Okay. Here's a question from a woman whose family were dairy farmers from Friesland that settled in northern New Jersey around 1890. Can you give her any information about the dairy farmers in New Jersey?
They lived in either what became Clifton. Do you have the last name?
Hoekstra's and Ettimas.
The dairy farms in northern New Jersey in 1900 were in largely Bergen County, which is across the river from Paterson, in what became the borough of Fair Lawn, and in Glen Rock, which is another borough. And then there were also dairy farms south of Paterson that served Paterson and Passaic, that in what became the city of Clifton. By roughly 1920-ish, land values were going up, and residential development was increasing, and especially in the 1920s. So then a number of those dairy farmers sold out and moved to Sussex and Warren County, up in the northwest corner of New Jersey, or they went north into New York State, into Orange County, New York, to around Goshen.
Okay, so just to remind everybody, we're talking to Professor Robert Schoone-Jongen, and we've got just a few minutes left. And so if you do have a question, now is a time to send it to us. This correspondent says that the Holland American ships often stopped in Southampton
Yes,
and then Ireland before they came
Yes.
to the United States.
and
So were they also picking up passengers there?
yes. Also, another place they would go is Le Havre, sometimes is Le Havre in France. Yeah, that was common. They, if they had room, they'd stop to put more people on. Remember, like I said, the big ships can hold as many as 1,500, 2,000 people in steerage, and that's where the money is.
So you have an article this month that was published that talks about some of this tension between whether to stay Dutch or whether to become American. And I know my family experienced that in Chicago in the 1920s.
Mhm.
But in general, as you tell these stories of immigrant communities in the East and the Midwest, how long would the Dutch language stay active in these American
Yeah.
settlements?
One of the easiest ways to gauge that is to look at the Dutch language publications that existed. There were the religious publications that were tied to the churches. The Christian Reformed Church had De Wachter, and I believe that finally ceased publication sometime in the 1960s. The newspapers that were not directly affiliated with a church to have them subsidized, those newspapers, the last of them probably disappeared in about 1945, 1950. I'll use Patterson as an example. There were 2 Dutch language newspapers in Patterson. One of them, Het Oosten, ceased publication in about 1930, and the Telegraaf about 1924 when the publisher retired. Poelstra was his name. In the 20s and 30s, most of the publications ceased, unless they had denominational subsidies.
So, now hearing you present for 2 times now for these lectures, it seems like the immigrant experience was in many respects a business experience, that this was not just happening out of some urge. It was also part of a business, a very large business enterprise that was trying
Absolutely.
to get immigrants to come to the United States.
The Holland America Line is the railroad companies and the steamship companies. This is big business for them. And they are working very carefully together so that you could buy a ticket on, let's say, the Holland America Line or the Hamburg America Line or North German Lloyd, any of them. You could buy a ticket in Europe that would get you exactly where you wanted to go in the United States. So you'd have your steamship ticket, and then you get off in New York or in the New York Harbor, and you would have your railroad ticket to where you were headed next. You paid for it in advance. And in the case of the railroad companies, they were hoping to be able to, especially the Western railroads, they were hoping to sell you land. Because remember, the United States government financed the building of the railroads in the West by giving land to the companies that did it. Well, the land did the company no good unless they could sell it. So people like Koch and this William Brown, who Nikolai follows out to North Dakota, the railroads had armies of these guys out there selling land. Some of them were scrupulous and some of them were not. Koch, truthfully, was, as those guys went, a pretty scrupulous guy. Doesn't mean he was always right. But the fact that the Dutch government made him the vice consul is pretty indicative that he had a pretty good reputation, because otherwise they would never have given him a job like that. And when he's the vice consul, in the existing correspondence, he is livid at railroad companies, particularly the Canadian Pacific Railroad Company, that were bringing people over under false pretenses, because they tended to end up at his doorstep in St. Paul, looking for a meal and a place to sleep and a job. And he had to try to go find them, and he did not like doing that.
Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. And again, we want to thank Dr. Robert Schoone-Jongen very much for the time and effort you put into this presentation. You told me before time that you had your second vaccination shot just yesterday. So we're glad we're glad you're safe and healthy. And
I'm impervious to green kryptonite now. You know?
we're so glad that you were able to join us today.
Thank you very much.
All of you who are listening to this, if you want to learn more about the NAF, you can go to our website, thenaf.org. Thank you all very much, and we look forward to seeing you all again much soon.
Have a good day, everybody. Thank you much.
Bye.
Thanks, Bob.